Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I'm currently the president of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. On this morning's show, we will be talking about the future of agriculture. I realize that's a pretty big topic, but here to help us kind of drill down a little bit is two guests from the Midwest that have, I think, a pretty vested interest in the future of agriculture. So before we get into the topic, into the discussion, I'd like each of you just to quickly introduce yourself, what you do, and why this particular subject is of interest to you. And Brandon, do you want to get us started with that?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Brandon Schlautman. I'm a multiple roles. I'm currently the lead scientist at the Land Institute for the Perennial Legumes program. That's a nonprofit research institute. It's based out of Kansas, but we do work with crops and collaborate with researchers around the country, trying to develop new perennial cropping systems. I also have a small cow-calf operation and am a co-founder of another business called Sustainagrain. Happy to be here today. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I'm Mike Carberry from Johnson County, Iowa, and I grew up in Benton County. My dad was a large animal veterinarian, and I have been involved with agricultural policy and climate policy probably since 2000 when I worked on the Al Gore campaign. And I had really became aware of agricultural issues at that time, and I currently work with the Sierra Club on their food and agricultural team. And also I'm on the board of the Iowa Farmers Union. And then I run my own consulting business called Green State Solutions, where I advocate on policies on regenerative and organic agriculture.
All right. Well, thank you both. Yeah, I do think we have a unique discussion. And of course, there's a lot of different directions we could go with this. But to kind of tee us off here, Mike and I are both from Iowa, but we're, again, all Midwest people here. But just to give our viewers just a little bit of a taste of what we have here in Iowa, Iowa has over 35 million acres of land, of which 30 million is farmed, 26 million is dedicated to cropland, or roughly 75%. And that is farmed by over 88,000, has over 88,000 farms, representing about 5% of Iowa's workforce. So it goes without saying that Iowa is a farming state, an agricultural state. Certainly the state of agriculture and how it's done continues to change and evolve. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about here. And to kind of get us started, I do want you to kind of weigh in on where you see the current demand for agriculture as our population, global population, continues to expand with, I think the estimate's around 10 billion people by mid-century. So a little bit around how you see things transpiring there, the demand for agriculture, the demand for technology around it, for innovative ways to use this land to feed the world. So either one of you can kind of jump in on kind of the current state of things.
Go ahead, Brandon.
Go ahead.
Brandon, you want to get us started?
Yeah, well, at the Land Institute where I'm at, we was started in 1976, so we've been around for a long time. And when we were started, our founder, Wes Jackson, one of his ideas for agriculture, after seeing some of the ways that we're maybe not practicing sustainability the way we should. We're not guaranteeing that we have the soil and other resources we need to be productivity long term. We're related to soil loss, and I would say that we still see the same levels of soil loss now in a lot of cases that we saw 20, 30, 40 years ago when the latest started. And if we look at Iowa's still averaging probably over 4 or 5 metric tons of soil loss per acre per year in row crop production, and I think that's a huge risk to the long-term productivity of the state. We just learned a little bit from Alan about how important economically agriculture is, and the percent of the population that is involved in that. And so I don't think there's any regardless of what happens in the world from a food security standpoint, I think Iowa's going to stay a leader in agriculture and kind of really wants to protect and maintain that productivity long term. And one of the ways we really need to do that is become a leader in this, I think, sustainable ag space, figuring out how to keep the soil on the land, figuring out how to contribute to some of the other issues. So we look at sort of the nitrogen and phosphorus runoff that is leading to problems like the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and some of the other climate challenges, pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back into Iowa crop ground to make it fertile long term. And I think there are solutions coming. And I think that I think we should all have hope and help producers in any way we can, support them in this sort of transition to more regenerative agriculture process. So, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that you said, Brandon. One of the things that we need to recognize as well is that this is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And one of the things that the Clean Water Act really doesn't address much is agriculture. And so you had mentioned the dead zone. There's a lot more than one dead zone. They're all over the world, and they're mostly because of agricultural runoff. And we really, not only do we need to focus on soil, but we also need to focus on hydrology and water. And a lot of that erosion that you're talking about is coming with the water and with the nutrients. And, we've got some serious issues here with the way that we currently farm. And maybe if we actually kind of go back to way that we used to farm a little bit more, and the way that some Native Americans still farm is in that regenerative type processes that look to take care of the soil and to actually build the soil health, and then also to keep the soil in place so it's not running off with the nutrients and down to the Gulf of Mexico, specifically for Iowa.
So yeah, there definitely seems to be there's a focus here, right, on protecting the environment, making sure that we, in this case, decrease the amount of erosion that is caused through modern agriculture and protecting our waterways, so on and so forth. I think, certainly there is the reality that I mentioned at the beginning, which is there is high demand for food, right? We all have to eat. I think, Mike, you made the comment before the show that there's just two types of people in the world, eaters and feeders, right? I'm an eater, right? I don't feed people, but we rely heavily on people that do feed other people. And so how should we think about this, in the sense that there's no doubt that there is the demand to feed people, and that means more production per acre, right? So that's better technology, whether that's seed technology, whether that's better farming equipment. There's the rise of autonomous farming, et cetera, et cetera. But how do we balance the meeting the demand that is out there to feed people, which is, nobody can argue, is very, very important, while at the same time protecting the land? What is the proper thinking there? I assume you don't think of it as like a zero sum, right? Like there is harmony that can be reached here. Could you, either one of you, comment on that?
Right. Well, let me take a first crack at that. You talk about feeders and eaters. One thing that we really need to start thinking about is Wes Jackson is a hero, but another hero of mine is a writer named Wendell Berry. And he says that if you eat, you're involved in agriculture, which is so true. But most of Americans don't know where their food comes from. And that's a problem. It does not come from the grocery store. And it doesn't all come from Iowa. Iowa imports 90% of its own food. We need to start thinking about something other than just efficiency. Efficiency is really how we got into this problem, and getting bigger. As they said in the 70s, go big or go home. And it's gotten that way. We have lost 90% of our farmers since the 1970s. And the farms have just gotten bigger and bigger and more efficient. And one of the ways that we see that is in confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. 95% of Americans eat meat, dairy, and eggs, yet 95% of the meat, dairy, and eggs come from industrial agriculture. This is what we call a CAFO, or a confinement. And that's not a very sustainable way to raise. animals, but it's a very efficient way to grow and produce meat. But there's a high cost to cheap food, and we can't. The only metric can't be calories per acre or even amount of food. That's got us into this serious problem of the environment. About a third of our greenhouse gases come from the food and ag industry, and the agricultural industry is the largest water polluter in the country and possibly the world. So it's not all about efficiencies. We have to really concern ourselves with what Brandon said earlier, is the sustainability of how we farm.
I want to eventually get into this realm that we talk about, perennial agriculture. But I think before we move that, I'm interested in the program and learning about it for the first time. And I think, one of the things that's changed a lot for me, we had a goose for Christmas every year. My grandma always raised the goose. And I think that there's a lot of difference in sort of the culture and the community of farming now than maybe what there was 20, 30 years ago. Farmers, or at least the farmer families, they grew a lot of the food they eat. And I think that's an important point that Mike brought up, is that, we got to decide what we want to eat someday. And that's important. And agriculture, had this kind of community culture aspect. And Wendell Berry does a good job talking about this. And I think, there's probably a lot of young people like me, maybe not as much in Iowa and parts of Nebraska, but when you get to the fringes of agriculture, to Kansas and some of these areas where the corn opportunity cost isn't so high, there are a lot of young people that are, they have a town job, but they still farm a little bit on the side. And I think that farming out a little bit on the side is pretty meaningful. That's a way that people like me can continue to fit into the culture and the community. And it's a way for us to participate in the community and in conversations with the people that are doing agriculture. And I think opportunities for that's really important. And, I think sometimes, Mike was talking about this move towards efficiency. We have to remember that people still live in communities, and, efficiency is important from a global food security standpoint. But I think locally, all of us, farmers, people in the ag community, we need to continue to think about how we're supporting our communities and caring for them, and how what we do during the day, how our occupation fits into that. And, I think all of us need to think about in the back of our mind, is the way I'm farming, what would my grandma think about the way I'm farming? What's my daughter going to think about the way that I'm farming right now when we're making some of those decisions? So what's my neighbor think about it? So
I think we need to evolve the conversation away from what we always hear: Iowa feeds the world. We need to start feeding our own community. And regenerative agriculture is a way that we can feed our own community and also build our community in a regenerative sort of way. So it's not just regenerative agriculture that we're talking about. We're talking about regenerative forms of life, and that how we can sustain each other with the food and with the work. And especially if it's local, those local dollars get turned over, and it's just better for our community. And eventually, wouldn't it be nice if a lot of our farmers could make a living just off their farm income instead of having to have that job in town? I would think that would be a great goal. And I know a lot of young folks really want to get into farming. And one of the problems is that the high cost of entry, the high cost of land, and a few other things. But, you can grow crops you can make a lot of money on 1 acre of vegetables. And it's a lot of work to farm 1 acre of vegetables. So, we need to start thinking a little bit more about feeding our community, and sometimes about localism. Iowa used to be the number 5 in apple production. I don't even think we're in the top 50. We don't grow much apples in Iowa anymore. There's a lot of crops we don't grow. We've become a monocrop state of basically corn and beans, and very little pasture, very little wheat, very little oats. It's basically 2 crops. And that is and 2 row crops. And that's, I guess Brandon can tell us a lot more about how we can get away from all the erosion that comes through basically having 2 row crops.
Yeah, I want to get into the perennial cropping that the Land Institute is researching and promoting. I think that's very interesting. Before we get there, I just want to spend maybe just a couple more minutes on I think what I think is the big point that's being made here, which is, yes, I mean, I was on a road trip with my son over the weekend, right? And we went up through Northeast Iowa, and it was beautiful. What I'm used to, the beautiful farms, and certainly wouldn't want to see all that go away and just have just nothing but fields. I think there's something very human and something that connects you to the land, right? Especially if you're raised in the state. So I do think you lose something there by just consolidating 88,000 farms into 10. So, there's the agricultural treadmill that we've been referencing, right? Which is we need to increase efficiency so we can increase output, the price then goes down, which means then there's kind of pressure to increase our farm size and innovate with our technology. And then that, right back into we need to increase efficiency. So I guess the question is, without spending too much time on it, but how do we, I mean, since these crops are mainly exported and the demand is coming from the world, right, on these global markets, that pushes for corn and soybean really to be the commodity of choice in Iowa. So how do we jump off this treadmill? I mean, is it too big to get off of? I mean, it's kind of capitalism at work, right? So any quick thoughts on that? And maybe it's too big of a question to solve in a minute, but any closing comments or thoughts on how we get off that treadmill, or if we should?
It has to be a transition. We did not get here overnight. It took 40 years to get here to kind of where we are today. It might take 40 years to get us to a more sustainable model. And part of that is not thinking about size. It's thinking about sometimes instead of thinking about yield and, bushels per acre, maybe we should start thinking about profitability sometimes. Is less inputs sometimes makes you make more money. And so how can you do that? And some of that is with organic and regenerative agriculture, because you're using less high energy and high expense inputs. And maybe if we move to a more sustainable model, people would understand that maybe they don't have to increase the size of their farm to increase their income.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into that. So when I became aware that, I became aware of the Land Institute, Brandon, where you're at, and the work that they're doing, and really for the first time became aware of this kind of perennial agriculture or perennial cropping. I think there's a few different terms that go around. So why don't you kind of just give us an overview of kind of the Land Institute and what they're focused on, specifically around how we can rethink, moving away, and maybe it takes 40 years, 100 years, 500 years, I don't know, but move away from this annual cropping and annual agriculture and into more of a sustainable approach to how we grow food.
Yeah, well, I like to talk about how, there's this sort of conservation versus productivity conundrum in agriculture. And I think what we're trying to say there is that, right now for most farmers, there are these short-term economic realities. They are faced with their business and profitability matters. And in balancing those short-term economic realities with the long-term conservation goals that, they likely have for their own farms is difficult. And the economics, a lot of times we think in the present and in the now. And, when we look at what are our best conservation practices available, a lot of those are land set aside programs, right? We think about the conservation reserve program, where we take land out of production and plant it to these, native perennial grass species. And what we really want is to have the same conservation outcomes as a sort of CRP planting within row crop production fields. And so at the Land Institute, we're trying to create new hardware that allows farmers to do that. And by hardware, we mean, can we make the actual crops that we're growing, our cash crops, perennial? And so we have a variety of different scientists that are, actually trying to breed or domesticate new crops. We have a perennial wheat breeding program. We have a new crop. The grain is called kernza, which is a perennial grass, intermediate wheatgrass, that we've been domesticating to turn into a perennial grain. And there are many farmers in the U.S. that are starting to play with this kernza perennial grain crop. We have a perennial sunflower breeding program, a perennial sorghum breeding program. I lead research in sort of two areas. One is developing a perennial pulse crop you know, thinking of a lentil or a chickpea or a regular pea that you plant one time but grows back every year, and humans can consume those pulses. You know, once you have a perennial, you eliminate a lot of the problems of annual agriculture that result from the annual disturbance, the tillage, the leaving the ground uncovered and vulnerable to erosion. And I think one of the other areas that I'm really excited about, and I work regularly with people in Iowa. You know, I was just in Des Moines today, visiting a friend, Sarah Lira, a collaborator who works at Corteva, and I work with a group of people at Iowa State, Cindy Bartell, Ken Moore, Raj Raman, on this idea of creating perennial cover crops, these perennials, new hardware that farmers could use to plant and protect their field year round. So the idea of a perennial cover crop is it's something that you plant one time. Think of sort of a lawn. One of the species we look at is actually Kentucky bluegrass. So we plant our whole field of Kentucky bluegrass, and then we use either strip tillage or we spray a narrow band every spring, and we plant our corn and soybean rotation into that. And the Kentucky bluegrass is there, you know, year round for multiple years in a row, providing that soil health benefits, soil protection benefits that a perennial species does well. And so that's a sort of novel system that we're working on. There's groups of people around the U.S. that are all excited about this perennial crop idea now. And there's a big new grant. It's called Regen PGC, $10 million USDA grant through Iowa State University that a lot of us are working towards that vision. And I think that's, you know, these sort of perennial grains or perennial cover crops are a way that we can eliminate this sort of trade-off for farmers having to choose productivity versus conservation benefits. It's new hardware that allows the farmers to achieve both things in the same field at the same time, without having to make some of those challenging economic decisions. So I think that's an exciting part of what the future of agriculture might look like, both in Iowa and, you know, throughout our grain producing areas of the U.S.
Brandon, that's really interesting about the Kentucky bluegrass. I'm wondering if Creeping Charlie starts choking that
out. Yeah.
Well, Creeping Charlie be a good cover crop? Cover crop.
There you go.
Well,
yeah, actually, at the Land Institute, I breed a clover species that's called Kura clover that we're looking at as the same way in the system. So we're in these early stages of choosing maybe what candidates might work best in those systems, and developing the management practices for that. We have on-farm trials in collaboration with Corteva and Iowa State, and Illinois and Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas with various farmers that are trying different versions of that. So pretty excited about it.
That's really exciting. Alan, one of the things that he's talking about cover crops and tillage, you know, we have been promoting in Iowa minimum tillage or strip tillage or no-till for close to 40 years. Yet we only have an uptake of about 20% of our of cropland is in minimum tillage or no-till. And we've been promoting cover crops now for 20 years. Yet in Iowa, we have an uptake percentage of only 5%. So that's a little too slow to get to where we really need to go. And, you know, so what is the answer to me? It's, you know, there are some incentives, you know, all over the place. Soybean Association, even the Farmers Union provides some cost share for doing things like cover crops. But what we really need is some massive incentives to do some of these things. And the benefits are huge. But maybe in the next farm bill, which comes up next year and we're working on right now, we can find more incentives for the conservation that Brandon was talking about, and also for this sort of perennial cover crops that would, to me, would make it even easier for a farmer to take up cover crops because there's less labor, and you only have to plant it once instead of having to plant it and then burn it down or roll it and crimp it down a couple times a year. So this to me is a wonderful thing, but how do we get people to start doing it?
Yeah, I think Mike, or I think it was Brandon, had made the comment about opportunity cost. And it seems like with most things in life, at least from my perspective, a lot of times there is this kind of cost benefit analysis, right? Or risk reward. And I think probably in this scenario, it's not much different, right? You're a farmer, you're looking at your land. What are you going to do with it? Well, you're probably going to do something that's going to benefit your family or your community the most, right? and doing it in the cheapest way possible. And while at the same time, right, trying to be environmentally conscious, so on and so forth. So, um, yeah, I think the cost benefit there is the regenerative farming something that makes economic sense. And um, it seems the consensus probably right now is that it doesn't, right? So how do we, and feel free to disagree with me on that, but how do we kind of uh, make the calculus a little bit more appealing and transitioning away? Maybe it's the science needs to progress or whatnot, but maybe Brandon, kind of talk about the reality on the ground and the progress the Land Institute is making to again in the future. Maybe this is the way things are going to be, but how do we get there? And
Yeah, I think the science is really important. Our breeding programs for the perennial grains of the Land Institute, we're making progress, but the yields are not equivalent to their annual counterparts. So, in the example with Kernza, our Kernza grain yields are still, maybe 20-25% of annual wheat. But if you look at our data and the progress we've made over the last decades, we're 15, 20 years away, 25 years away from achieving similar yields with wheat. So we need to figure out how to continue to fund that research, to continue to fund those breeding efforts. The same is true with the perennial cover crops. We know that they're providing a lot of these sort of what we call ecosystem services in the system. And we have a lot of evidence that we can achieve yield parity with our normal conventional systems when the conditions are right. But the reason that corn and soy production in Iowa are so successful is that there's been so much research stacked on top of each other that make them really resilient in terms of we know the management practices. We know farmers know how to do it right on a consistent basis to maximize those yields. And so we really need the research for these perennial systems to make sure that we can provide growers with the best genetics and the management practices to do it right on a consistent basis. And then, like Mike said, there needs to be the sort of education and extension systems and the policy that's going to help incentivize that as well as we go forward.
Well, I'm going to get back to my comment about getting away from the yield parameter and start thinking about profitability. We're seeing already farmers in Iowa and across the country that are using regenerative systems that have built their yield up to almost exactly, or if not more than it was before when they were doing conventional. And what we're seeing then is the profitability per acre is a lot more because they have less input costs. And it also is then better for the soil health, which is then better for holding on to the soil, filtering the water, retaining the water in this climate change world that we live in, where we either have too much water or not enough. And good soil health is paramount to that. And one of the things we also need to think about in Iowa is that 60% of our cropland is cash rented. And so does a renter treat his land the same way as that a farmer operator that owns that land? And that's an interesting thing. So what are the incentives that we can provide for a landowner and then also a tenant farmer?
Yep. Well, great points, fellas. And a fascinating topic. Certainly humans are innovative, and we're going to continue to try to hopefully take care of the land that we have and feed ourselves, feed the world. But I appreciate all the good work that you're doing, and I hope our listeners learned something today, and hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. Take care now.
Thank you.